thanks for joining today's session. We're going to try to do little different things than what we used to do as a part of PTV Talks today. As some of you at least might know, we've been having this survey going on all year part of May, I guess. As a part of this ITE virtual drop-in session, and we did, due to time constraints, we could share all the details, but we wanted to have another opportunity to talk more about the survey results here. So the title for today's session is survey says, microscopic model development and calibration state of the practice. Where are we at? So as I have briefly mentioned, this in today's session is going to be done in two folds. First part, I'm going to be presenting the survey result a bit more in depth, and then part two is going to be moderated by Bill, and we have 4 panelists who've been in the modeling industry for quite a long time, and hear about their thoughts and experiences. So first of all, here's the details on our survey. We've conducted this survey virtually, online, starting on May 3rd, and we had it open for 3 weeks, and we had 17 questions that we have asked. It's quite a bit, but a lot of people, thankfully, went through all the 17 questions and provided all those valuable answers. And those were the questions on general microscopic simulation modeling and calibration practices that they've been they've been doing. And there was no product-specific question or questions. And as a result, we got exactly 300 responses. And with that, we started to analyze the survey results. So the first poll that we want to go with, and that we want to ask you is, did you participate in our survey? So there are 3 options. So let's take maybe 20, 30 seconds for you to answer. And so in other words, were you one of those 300 people, I would say? All right, so it seems like I cannot see it that big enough here. Let me just make it larger. So 44% responded that they have participated, and 24% said they're aware but didn't get a chance to participate. 31% said didn't hear about this survey. Okay, sounds good. So let me proceed to this entire the other series of questions that we have asked. Our first question was to ask you who you are. So the question was, what is your current employer type? I gave 3 options: public sector, private sector, and academic sector. As you can imagine, 72% of the people responded. People were saying that they're from private sector, 15% from public sector, and 13% from academic sector. The second question was quite similar. I have asked them to define their professional background, and we have allowed them to choose, select all that apply types of question. And about 86% of people define themselves, as transportation engineer, 62% transportation modeler, 38% manages the project, and 27% of people said they're reviewing the project. Another follow-up question was, how long have you been working on these microscopic simulation models and tools? There were 5 options that you could choose from: less than 1 year, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 7, 7+ years. It seems over majority, 61% of the people answered that they've been doing this microsimulation modeling work over 7 years, while only 3% answered that they've been doing this less than 1 year. And the rest were evenly spread, I guess. 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 7 were all at around 11 to 14% range. So those were the types of people who responded to our survey. So now here's another set of questions, which is, first, currently, what types of projects are you using microsimulation for? We gave them 7 options, and we also allowed them to type up their own answers. And also, again, this was select all that apply types of question. As you can imagine, 75% of people said they're using this like microsim for freeway modeling, and also 74% of people said corridor or arterial analysis as well. And in addition, 71% answered yes to unconventional intersection or interchange evaluation projects. And about 38% people said they're using microsim for public transit analysis. And about 33% on large-scale traffic impact analysis, such as master planning. And about 29% answered yes to managed lanes or toll road project, and 14% on connected and automated vehicle study. So here are some answers that we've got, and for those people who chose others, somebody said e-scooter analysis, some others said airport roadways analysis, and and the other one was bike lane projects, highway, rail at grade crossing studies, and also in addition to large scale, small to medium traffic impact studies, intersection safety study, and work zone traffic control assessments. Those were the additional types of answers that we've got. Okay, the next question that I posed was, I have asked the participants to rank the following tasks, 5 tasks that I have listed up from most to least critical factors for your successful project delivery. Okay, huge number of people, chose data collection and reduction as the most critical task out of 5. In average, 1 to 10, they could choose from 1 to 10, and then in average, 3.97 was the score that data collection and reduction has got, and about 51% of people answered that that is the most critical task or step. Calibration and validation follows that, 3.54. It was a pretty good number of people who still thinks that that is the most critical one. Base model development is 3.4. So pretty close to calibration and validation, but slightly lower than that. And then scenario testing and result presentation or output presentation was ranked quite low, and the average was around 2. So we went a little deeper and and checked out whether there's any sort of significant differences that we see from the participants background. So we did group those responses to be public sector versus private sectors, and it was quite similar at the end. But it seems there are general perception on public sector respondents or participants that they are more concerned, or they think that base model development is a bit more critical compared to the other tasks, and also compared to the responses that we've got from private sector participants. All right, and also I did broken down into a couple of different bins, the years of experiences that they have, with the microsim, but I couldn't find that whatever significant variations or differences from this. All right, so next question that I posed was, I asked people to define model calibration in your own words. There were quite a bit, 260 or 70 various ways of defining model calibration. However, we did group them together, and it all came down to quite similar types of answers that we were getting. So first of all, huge number of people were basically saying that they're trying to adjust model parameters. The emphasis goes to adjusting the model parameters in order to meet the field conditions. And about 30% of people was saying more or less confirmation that the model represents the field conditions. So the more emphasis for those people was going to I want to confirm that this reflects the real conditions, more so than mentioning about the model parameter adjustments. So here are some sample responses that we've got. So first one, I'll read it out. Calibration is adjusting the model inputs and driving behavior parameters to better reflect existing conditions in order to improve the model's validation. The other one was making the model most accurately resemble real-world conditions, existing and predicted future. All right. The other one is model optimization based on the real-world traffic flow. The iterative process of adjusting model parameters to replicate field conditions. And I think I did particularly like this answer here, which was the most challenging task in microsimulation models. Why not? All right, let me proceed to the next slide. So our next question was, please define model validation at this time. So there were a little bit more variety of answers that we were getting, but still the majority of people, which is over 50, about 53% of people answered more like comparing the model outputs to existing conditions to check the accuracy. So there was a bit of a unclear sort of a a clear cut. I mean, there was no clear cut on the responses in between calibration and validation. However, about 16% of people was putting more emphasis on saying, oh yeah, we're trying to use a second set of independent field measured data to check the accuracy. So quote unquote, in here, the emphases are going to the second set of independent data. There were some other responses, such as visual check or statistical analysis and so forth, but those were relatively minor responses that we were getting. So here are some responses that we've got, some simple answers that we've got from people. So here you go, testing the robustness of a model on a new data set to make sure the model was not overfitted on a particular data set. The other answer that we've got was testing the calibrated model with a similar data set. I'm not entirely sure, but anyways. The other answer that we've got was validation is to verify the calibrated with additional independent MOE. Okay, checking the model output against in-field observations and measurements. The other one that we had, it was usually means using the GEH score to check the validity of the model volumes as well as visual observation and travel times. Okay, here are some more. Somebody said, this is a vague term, means nothing to me beyond calibration. Similar types of response that we've got was rarely use model validation, just use model calibration. Okay, and the last one that I have picked here is involves testing a variety of conditions. Don't tend to do this. All right. Okay, let me move on to the next question, which was question number 8. I have asked people that how do they collect their calibration data or data for modeling purposes in general, I guess. So there were 4 options that people could choose from, and as you can see, 94% of people answered that they do collect data from the field. There could be various ways of collecting the data from the field. We didn't specifically ask the details about it, but 94% of people answered that they chose that they're doing the field data collection. And about 69% of people also said that they're utilizing the data that was collected for another projects, previous projects. And about little over half of the people utilizes commercially available big data sources, and about 49% of the people uses the available online data portals as well. Because we could see that a lot of cases where people were choosing more than one, also because we did set these questions to be select all that apply. I just wanted to see what types of data, what types of sources, are being used together the most. As I mentioned, field data collection has showed the highest number and highest percentage. And it seems like based on my analysis, it seems like field data collection goes pretty well. I mean, quite often it goes together with the data that is being collected from other projects or previous projects, as well as commercially available big data. So it was about 65% of people uses from the data from previous project and field data collection, and like a little over half of the people said they're using commercially available big data, and also they do a field data collection as well. Some other types of like the people, for those people who has answered other, here are some of the answers that they did put up. Probe data and analytics, excuse me, and field data using drones, Bluetooth split monitor for signal data. So this maybe fall under that field data collection, but they specified what that is. And also driving behavior parameters from previous studies or agency guidelines. They're using that as a data source. And then video processing data and professional judgment based on past studies. That was the other types of answers that we've got. Okay, so the other types of the next question that I posed was, what types of data do you use to calibrate your model? 5 options that I gave people. There could be more, but we limited this at 5. And about 94% of the people uses volume data. It could be turn count, it could be link count, using that volume data for the calibration purposes to make sure that your model's reflecting the field condition. 87% of people said travel time, 7%, 70% said queue length, and about 44% said they're using some types of a traffic flow pattern data, such as historical data that Google Maps provides. And about 18% of the people said they're using trajectory data. The other types of data that they're using, before we get to that, I guess, I just wanted to do the similar types of correlation types of study analysis and see what types of data are going together the most. So volume data obviously was pretty high, and I mean the highest, I should say. And volume data has been used along with the travel time. About 81% or 82%, it should be pretty close to, are using both volume and travel time data. And about 60% of people uses volume data and queue length data, and travel time data and queue length data as well. So those were the options that was chosen together the most. So other types of data that they chose was speed data. I forgot to add speed data probably, that's why. And the other one was by lane information, most importantly capacity, headway, number of stops, actual travel demand data /OD was another thing that we've seen there, and observed delay, saturation flow rate, throughput reductions on freeways, and visual audits, and transit ridership. That's what we've got as other answers. All right, question number 10 was, how long do you collect your calibration data for? There were 5 options that you could choose from. First one was less than 1 day, primarily just during peak hours. And the other one was 1 day, 1 to 3 days, 3 to 7 days, and over 1 week. I think, about 30% of the people said they collect data for less than 1 day. It's only peak hours, I guess, or a little over peak hour, peak period. And another 30% of people said they collect data for 1 to 3 days, maybe during just weekday type of data collection that they do. And about 19% of people said that they collect data for over 1 week, 13% for 3 to 7 days, 9% said 1 day. My another question was, how do you ensure that the calibration data that you have collected are representing the typical day condition? So, of course, there were cases where people chose to mention multiple things, but I had to pick one or the other, whichever was either whichever I could see that people were choosing the most critical, as the most critical thing. So about 29% of people said they do consider seasonal variation, and do consider that they want to do that not during vacation seasons or cold weather or what, and also weather, constructions in that study area, incidents, whether there was any incidents happening or not. And also they said that they do collect data on Tuesdays through Thursdays and avoid Monday, Friday, and weekends. And also they try to collect data for multiple days. And about 7% of the people said that they either said they follow Federal Highway Administration guidelines or do conduct cluster analysis or statistical analysis. And about 25% of the people said they do cross-check this data that they're using up against the big data sources that they might have access to, or some other historical data that they have access to as well. There was about 25% of the people. About 10% answered that they do the field visit to check the traffic pattern and see the, check the reasonable, whether the data that they're using are reasonable or not. And also they do apply engineering judgment and also try to utilize that, look at the local knowledge. And about 6% said they do consult with the client or reviewing agency and let them make decision. And about 8% answered that they do not check and they just use whatever data that is available. All right, and about 7% of the people said they do average out the data that was collected from multiple days, and sometimes they were saying that like they do average out for the data from multiple data sources, I think, in some cases. And also, in some cases, they apply adjustment factors to the volume or the data that they have, such as like seasonal adjustments, I would think. So here you go. Like here's our second question that that I want to ask you today. So question is, are you aware of Federal Highway Administration's Traffic Analysis Toolbox Volume 3 2019 update? Not the original version, but the updated version that was published and made available in 2019. So we'll give you some time to answer to that. All right, Liz, can you close the poll then? All right, so here are the answers that we've got. About 22% of the people said that they're aware of it and they've been applying it actively. 41% said, yes, I'm aware of it, but I rarely use it. And 37% said they've not heard of it. Okay, sounds good. And then we're going to proceed to the slide. So, okay, so here's one thing that I want to quickly share with you all, especially for those of you who've not heard of this, like Traffic Analysis Toolbox Volume 3 update, 2019 update. So there's openly available, and you can download it from their Federal Highway USDOT website. And here are some parts that I did pull out from that documentation. First of all, here's how they would like people to identify those representative days, not a typical day, but representative days. I'll read it out here. In here, it says, in this step, the analyst takes the data from the travel conditions identified using cluster analysis or other statistical methods and prepares them to support calibration. A key element of this preparation is the identification of one representative day for each travel condition. And also it said, there's a part where it says, it is important to focus calibration on a single observed day, since that day can be characterized in a microsimulation model with specific incident locations, travel times, and other performance data. Attempting to calibrate a model to a synthetic day created by the averaging together of multiple days is not recommended. So just I wanted to share this with everyone who's attending the session, so that it could be acknowledged and known by the people at least who is attending today's session. All right, here's our last question to you for during today's session. So my question to you is, how did COVID change your data collection and reduction activities? Did it change? No? Or if not, if it did, how did it change? There are three options that you can choose from, and we'll look forward to see your responses. All right, I think we're getting closer to the end. All right, okay. So the result is here. 7% of the people responded and said like there was no change. They're collecting data as usual. So it's a very low percentage, right? And about 48% of the people responded and said we used the data collected pre-COVID pandemic. And then like 45% said we collect data and apply adjustment factors. So, okay, sounds good. And let me go to the next questions. So our next question was, what do you think about people saying that microsimulation is too expensive and complicated? So 0 meaning I do not agree, it is not complicated and it's not expensive at all. 10 meaning I do completely agree, it is very expensive and it is very complicated. So honestly, I thought like, average response or average scoring that we're gonna get was gonna be 7 or 8, but surprisingly, like the mean value was like 5. And even more surprisingly, like having 5 in the middle, like it was like about 50-50. About 40% chose like 0 to 4, and another 40% chose 6 to 10. So people are relatively neutral to this like statement. So I went to a little more in depth, and as you can imagine, people from academic field were more like disagreeing to the statement where it says like it's too expensive and too complicated, because their average was 4.1, and private and consultants were right at the middle, 4.97, and responses that we've got from public sector was a little higher than the average, which was 5.42. The next question that I posed was, I'm going to jump over to question number 15, which was how much time do you spend on calibrating and validating your model out of the entire project modeling effort that you're putting together. So 5 options that people could choose from: less than 10% in terms of time and effort, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 50, and 50 or more. About 11% of people said they spend less than 10% of the effort on calibrating and validating the model. About 25% said like 10 to 20, 35% 20 to 30, 23% said 30 to 50, and 6%, there were 6% of people saying that like they're spending over 50% of the time and effort calibrating and validating the model. So now I wanted to find out the correlation in between these and the level of that they chose, in terms of how whether that microsimulation is expensive or and complicated or not. Now, as you can imagine, there was a direct correlation. Those people who said that oh, I'm spending less than 10% on calibration and validation, their average response here was 3.94, while for those people who have answered that they're spending more than over 50% of the time and effort on calibration and validation, their average response was 5.78. So clearly we could see that that calibration and validation is a big burden that people people go through while they're working on this microsimulation modeling projects. All right, so another follow-up question that we had was, if you or your client think that microsimulation is too expensive and too complicated, what are the biggest contributing factors to that? And we have allowed them to choose all that apply. All right, about 72% of the people chose to go with the model calibration time, the amount that it takes, the amount of effort, I would say, to calibrate the model. About 64% said that the amount of time that it takes and effort that it takes to develop the model, and about 47% answered and said that required amount of data, and about 42% chose to go with staff knowledge level, their own staff knowledge level, and then about 37% chose to go with also said software and data cost of it. All right, and then I did break it down to different group of people who responded, private, public, and academic. And there were some interesting stuff that we could find here. First of all, like, public and private agencies, participants from private sector and public sector was having slight different, opinion on, model calibration time and model development time. Public agency people still feels like that, model development time is the biggest burden, even though calibration time was like high enough, while private sector with, participants chose model calibration time as the highest, the biggest, the contributing factor. And another interesting thing that we found out here was like the participants from public agency with the public agency background, they tend to choose the staff knowledge level as one of the most, one of the biggest contributing factor to the fact, to those impressions on microscopic simulation models are being complicated and expensive. So as a matter of fact, that was the second highest answer that we've got out of those participants working for a public agency. So here are some answers that we've got. Okay, others, for those people who chose others. Microsimulation may be appropriate in some cases, depending on the context. For preliminary analysis, HCM-like method may be wholly appropriate. For decisions on pocket lengths and semi-actuated control features, microsimulation may be the best option. Typical clients' horrible bias against a tool that they themselves don't command, and thus disheartening adherence to correlational model. The other answer that we've got was they compare to HCM, which requires less time to code, thus less cost to them. Trust in results compared to less expensive option. So there's those three responses at the bottom are pretty much saying the same thing. Another set of answers that we've got was require a certain level of skill and time if using a consultant means a lot of money. And the other answer was insufficient quantity and quality of data, lack of general agreement on how models should perform. And somebody said model answers only one question, not flexible. Okay, inconsistent modeling practices make it hard to trust results, raises suspicions of bias. And software complexity was the other one, links to training and knowledge. And the last one that I have here is short time frames and budget constraints. Okay, the other question that I had was, do you use any types of published guidelines when calibrating and validating your models? Okay, the biggest portion of people said, 38% said my local agency, it could be state DOT or some other level, have or has specific guidelines for a microscopic simulation. 38% said that, and about 31% said my local agency, my local state or agency does not have any specific guidelines for microsimulation, so they're using guidelines provided by Federal Highway Administration. 19% said that there's no guidelines available. Calibration and validation is completed with reviewer's judgment, or it could be more seen as engineering judgment as well. 19%. And about 4% of the people specifically mentioned that my local agency does not have any guidelines, so they're using the guideline published by the other agencies, such as the other state DOTs. That was the answer that we've got. Okay, so we're going to jump over to one of our last questions that we had, question number 16, which was, when you first find out that your model does not match the field data, what do you do first? About 62% of people said they're going to check their base model and see whether there were any errors in terms of model coding. And about 14% of people answered that they're going to check the field data and see whether there was any bias or noise or so on and so forth. And about 18% said that they're going to start right away, start updating the calibration parameters. The last question that we had, question number 17, was what is the main or first parameter that you are going to adjust when you start calibrating the model? So we gave them 4 options and like also like an option to choose others. And about 27% of people answered that like they're gonna play around with the car following model or headway or time gap related parameters. And about 25% of people wants to, will adjust the desired speed information first. And about 2% chose to go with acceleration and deceleration data profiles, I should say. And about 34% said they're going to adjust the lane changing behaviors. Of course, it really depends on case by case. It really depends on like, the types of project that you're working on. But we wanted to get a feel for like, what is their like first like go-to parameter set as well. All right, this is what I, the result that we had. And now I'll pass this over to Bill for panel discussion. Bill?
Excellent. Thanks, Jong-sun, for the great presentation and uncovering all those survey results. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my webcam and ask the panelists and Jong-sun to do the same as we enter into phase 2 of this webinar. So thanks again, Jong-sun, and thanks everyone for attending, and especially many of you may have also attended our virtual drop-in session a few weeks ago with ITE. Hopefully what you see is we had so many great responses that Jong-sun was able to really dive much deeper into this presentation and even show ways that you could dissect the answers by the employer type and things like that really helped to give us a good feel for whether or not it's consistent or there's some differences depending on which sector the modeler was based in. So to start with, I just want to give a beforehand thank you and announce our panel members with their affiliations, because they might be a little shy, but actually why don't we go around and have you guys do it yourself. Make sure you say where you're coming from, so we give a little props to your firm for all the work that you guys do and your participation in this webinar. So I'm just going to look on my screen and go left to right. So Joe.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Joe Blasey. I'm with HNTB in Kansas City, Missouri, and I've been using PTV products for, gosh, coming up on 20 years.
Thank you. Randy?
I'm Randy Johnson, Senior Traffic Engineer with DKS Associates out of Portland, Oregon. I've been working with a variety of microsimulation models and multi-resolution modeling approaches for about the past 16 years.
Perfect. Sean?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Sean Burse with RSNH. I'm based out of Jacksonville, Florida, and I've been using PTV products since the late 90s, so just over 20-some years.
Cool. Last but not least, Dave?
Hi, I'm Dave Stanek with Fair and Peers. I'm from Sacramento, California, and like most of the staff on the panel here, I've been using simulation modeling for almost actually a little over 20 years, starting with CoreSim and then with VisSim shortly after that.
Perfect. Well, thanks again. We have a few questions that we had to pose to you guys on the panel, 3 in particular. And as we go on, if there's time permitting, I created a bunch of questions based on the responses Jong-sun was reading that I thought could at least do a little round table of, either all or some of you guys answering. So, but to start out with, the first question is, what is your experience? What can you tell us about your own experience using, the FHWA's update, the 2019 update to the Traffic Analysis Toolbox, Volume 3, and maybe we can go in the same order that we guys introduced ourselves.
Okay, well, I'll start. So to me, the new guidance, there's kind of 2 main changes that I've noted. One is the cluster analysis discussion and the identification of a representative day, and then the other is kind of the criteria used for calibrating a model. And so for the cluster analysis, we've been trying to match the spirit of that and try to take the data that's available to us and cluster it. from what I could tell from the guidance, what they really want you to do is get a ton of data, a year or more if you can, and try to stratify it by different parameters and look at it different ways and try to cluster it into multiple groups to be able to say things like you have a bunch of days that have heavy traffic and a bunch of days that have severe weather, and you have a bunch of days that have an incident, and you have a bunch of quote unquote average days, and cluster them that way. In terms of what we feel that we have the time and budget to do, we've been trying to take the data that we have, and sometimes we do have a good amount of data. Usually we're looking at travel time data, big data sources of travel time data, and we try to group that into, or at least find a cluster of average data of that travel time data. And so we at least try to capture that cluster that represents average days. And then within that, we try to identify a representative day within that cluster. And so I would say we're still really just choosing one day to model. I think the guidance would recommend that you look at several different scenarios, but we're still kind of going with that average, more or less average day. And then in terms of the criteria, there's and I don't think we got into it too much in this presentation, but there's a couple of criteria about looking at deviation from the mean and looking at standard deviation, 1 and 2 standard deviations away from the mean data. We do our best to match that criteria. I think they want something like 2/3 of your data within 1 standard deviation and 95% within 2 standard deviations for a given parameter. And then there's also these calculations called BDAE and BDSE. Let's see if I can get this here. Bounded dynamic absolute error and bounded dynamic systematic error. So, is your data very far away from the mean consistently? I think that's the BDAE, and then checking to see if your data, maybe it's not that far away, but it's always higher than the mean, or it's always lower than the mean. That's the bounded dynamic systematic error. So we do try to follow that criteria and look at those data points to match the best we can.
Great, thanks, Joe. I also should mention, if there's somebody on the panel, at any point that you want to, jump in, or I guess what my point of saying, don't worry if your answers are more in depth on certain questions and less on others. I guess that's partly why Johnson and I were so happy to have 4 of you guys join with such experience. So Joe, thanks so much for that detailed. Randy?
Yeah, so my experience pretty closely mimics what Joe was explaining there. The cluster analysis is something we've been looking to apply. In fact, recently we had proposed that on a project, and even did some during the proposal phase, even had done some cluster analysis to show the benefits. And in the end, it was, well, we don't have a schedule and budget for that level of analysis, so let's just do sort of the average weekday. And let's see, it was question 13, I think. There was 37% stated that the data cost was too high. And so that there's already a lot of folks that think there's too much of the budget going to data. Cluster analysis only increases that budget and schedule. And so I think that's the conflict is, as modelers, we want to get into that cluster analysis so we could identify and really, produce models that can be validated under multiple conditions between high volume, low volume, incidents, weather, all those different factors. And so that's often conflicting directions, is we rarely get the budget and schedule to do that in-depth level of analysis. So we're still trying to pursue that. Some of the big data sources that we have certainly bring down some of that data cost, especially when the agencies, if they already have a subscription. If they don't, then maybe there's especially if there's an OD element involved, you might be tens of thousands of dollars added onto the overall budget. So that's always been a challenge. We do a fair amount of data scrubbing up front to make sure that the data we are basing our model on for the average weekday is a representative data set. One challenge you have when you're doing field data collection is you don't know on the days you're going to collect. Often we try to do 2 to 3 day minimums of data collection, so you're not just basing everything on one day. And then we'll rely on the big data or something like IPEMS or any of these DOT data archives to kind of go through and see, okay, the times that we did collect data, is that a representative day, and do we need to do any adjustments off of that? And then I would say on the calibration side, so a lot of my work's in the Northwest, in Oregon and Washington. We have each DOT has their own VSIM protocol that's quite thorough. Doesn't quite go into as much detail with the 2019 on some of the statistical analysis, but that's what we largely use for our calibration efforts, or those 2 DOT protocols.
Excellent. Thanks, Randy. I'll throw out 2 as you guys are at. We did get one question in related to all this, and you guys are kind of answering it as part of the answer to the question that's asked, but just any advantage that you've experienced by using the cluster analysis with simulation that's been asked by one of the audience members. Let's move on to Sean.
All right, thanks. Similar stories to Joe and Randy in regards to, based on budget and time, we really haven't focused much on a clustered analysis. It's something, we've thought of, but I felt kind of bad. I was a panel member on the traffic analysis toolbox update, and I've yet to really implement a lot of their recommendations. A lot of my work is in Florida, and we have a Florida-specific traffic analysis handbook that's more tailored to the 2004 traffic analysis toolbox, and a combination of recommendations from other states as well, as far as parameter sets for core SIM as well as VSIM. And I think just in general, a similar theme to other stories is the cluster analysis just is very challenging in terms of the time to collect the data, the budget for the data, and then to analyze all that data to get your various days you want to assess. So I don't see in my area in the Southeast, especially Florida, really moving forward or adopting the cluster analysis. And of course, if I'm not going to get a budget to support the extra data collection, I'm not going to really embrace that. But what we try to do is, a lot of times for turning movement counts, we'll probably only have 1 day's worth unless we know that there's a major incident that would warrant a recount. A lot of our mainline data, there's online sources that we have several days that we can incorporate. And worst case, if something happened to turning count, or if there was an issue, we can apply those percentages. But really, a lot of our freeway projects are mostly have issues on the main line themselves. So if there was an incident, we can see that volume is significantly lower, or the speeds are lower than a typical day. So we try to look at some historical information or archive data to at least find a decent typical day, if you will, for our projects. In terms of calibration, one thing that the toolbox has taken out is some of the subjective information, analyst satisfaction. They want more quantitative measures, and that makes sense. A couple of the ones that we focus on are travel time. Capacity is a big one, of course, and then our speed profiles we plot to make sure we capture the location and the duration of those congested areas. And then one thing to point out is a lot of folks kind of focus on the simulated versus input, correlation, the GEH statistic. And one thing we found in congested areas, your input should be higher than your actual throughput. Otherwise, if you're putting in your count at that bottleneck, you're not going to have that congestion. However, a lot of people that check the box, or they might not have enough data to really get an estimate of the demand. They just put in that count. They don't have the congestion, so then they're cranking all these knobs in vSim. You know, they're doubling the headway. They're changing all these parameters to say, all right, I got to hit my travel time, or I got to hit my speed. And then in the future condition, to make their model work, they strip all those parameters and make them more default. So it's one thing we've run into. We don't practice that, but we do a lot of reviews, and they spend a lot of time to try to hit those metrics to check the box that their model is calibrated. But at the end of the day, you don't really have a valid model, and you're stripping out a lot of those parameters anyway. So there still needs to be a lot of education. I know we want to make more advancements and more data and more assessment, but I think there's a lot of folks out there that still might not understand some of the fundamentals in simulation and why the results might not be what you expect. And a lot of it goes into your inputs and some of those bottleneck issues that are upstream or even downstream that back up, and why your model isn't giving you the results that you expect. And most of the time it does come down to the volume that you're putting into the model, not the parameters themselves. But
okay, great. Thanks, Sean. Dave?
Yeah, I don't have much experience with applying this. I was excited to see when the new update came out, but in most cases, either the amount of data that's needed, as some of the other panels were saying, to do the cluster analysis isn't available because the locations that we're studying are older locations that need improvement. So improvements haven't been made out there, so there's no data collection stations out there for us to get the data from. Or trying to collect things like the big data is too expensive and beyond what the clients are willing to pay. I've also not seen a lot of demand from the agency side asking us to use these new versions. The reviewers there are comfortable using the older version. They've learned how to use the older version and are not yet interested in looking at what the new versions have. So while we've had some of those conversations when we're talking about developing the methodologies that we're going to be using on a particular study, we haven't yet had any reviewers or agencies take us up on that option to try some of these methodologies.
Okay, great. Well, thanks all for your feedback. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I know it's 5 minutes to the end of the hour. We didn't let the audience in on this, but as panelists, prepping at a time, we were already planning on going over. How's that for typical ways to do this? So we're going to hang in there at least probably the way this is going, I would imagine, until maybe an extra 10 minutes. But understanding that some audience members might need to pop off, is it fair to say, I'm going to put you guys all on the spot, that I'm seeing some good questions come in the question box, and we won't be able to get to all of them during this session. But is it fair to say that you guys would be willing to have PTV share your contact information, email, for instance, that some of the folks that might have some questions specifically to some of your things that you guys are sharing from your experience would be able to reach out to you directly? I just want to get that commitment from you guys before the top of the hour. Okay, so Sean's giving me a thumbs up. Joe's nodding. All right, there we go. Okay, good. So anybody who's on the call, if you do have to hop off, we understand. We do have the documentation of your questions. We'll make sure we share the ways to contact our panelists as well. So second question that I'm going to do, and maybe we do this one as a jump in, as you might want to add to it, because some of you guys already talked about big data. But the second question was just, if you can share a little bit of how you're using big data in your simulation modeling. And I know I've heard it a few times from you guys, but if there's anything else that any of you would like to add, I'm not going to call on you necessarily. Just go ahead and be civil about how you're, cutting into each other's time. So whoever wants to jump in on that first, feel free.
Well, I can go ahead and go first, since I was going last. We've been using big data to address the issue with not having enough historical data, right? So when we've been doing our studies and we are ready to collect data, the pandemic hit, and traffic volumes were much slower when we were ready to do that data collection. So instead, we had to rely on historical data, but that historical data was incomplete. And so on a couple of projects now, we've done about 50% historical data, and then we had to fill in the gaps with about another 50%. And so one of the ways that we're using big data is using streetlights data's estimates for volumes from those time periods. And so that's one piece of it. And then the other piece of it would be using data from speeds of vehicles. And some of the vendors for that are like INREX or WeCho provide speed of different roadway segments on specific days. So we've been using that to help collect some of that data.
I guess I'll go next to keep the order progressing. As far as big data, we typically use streetlight data to support our freeway projects. And we use it for two main aspects. One is for OD patterns. And it's very important for express lane projects, especially just to get a good assessment of the potential express lane utilization with different trip lengths. So that's very valuable. So we use that as a seed matrix for ODME. And then we also use the travel time to assist with calibration if we don't have other means. But the focus primarily with the big data has been just with the OD patterns at the current time anyway.
Great.
Yeah, from my experience, it's similar to Dave and Sean. A lot of OD analysis, a lot of speed and volume estimation. I would say some more of the newer applications we've been looking into, especially with the COVID traffic. The question is, are we going to return to normal? So should we utilize pre-COVID data and use that as the basis for analysis, or is there really a different future that we need to be testing? And so we're looking at some sensitivity tests where we're identifying OD patterns into areas that have the highest change of work from home. So from, or I guess home to office being converted to telecommuting. And so we're looking at identifying those OD patterns and using that for a range of sensitivities of what if only 80% of that comes back, or what if 90% of that comes back? What will that do to traffic volumes and capacity evaluation? And then another application, we were looking at WeCho data, which provides high resolution data from OEMs, automotive sources. And we use it for safety analysis to identify, basically do hotspot mapping of hard braking. And so while that wasn't in a modeling application, we see some potential for use with trajectory analysis and looking at, are we getting the same types of braking characteristics in the model? I know we were able to use that information to identify where there's some vertical curve issues that led to some hard braking. And that type of data may not come through when you're in the typical data that you would collect for microsimulation applications. So the WeCho data with the 5-second resolution data is a lot of potential there.
And I'll just say real quickly that the two biggest things we use, I think maybe it's the same as what Sean said, is we use the OD type data as a seed matrix when developing our ODs, and then we use the speed and travel time data for calibration type applications.
Excellent, thank you. I am dual duty here, also manning the question box. We have a lot of very interested folks on the call. I think we could have made this into a 3-hour minimum, little one-off course. But anyway, that's really great. Thanks for all answering that. So any question that was, so I've got some specific things I would like your guys' feedback on some of Jongson's questions, and so maybe we'll pop those and I'll read in some of these questions from the other folks as well. But as I'm organizing that a little bit in my own mind, was there anything else that you haven't already said that maybe based on the results of our survey that Jongson presented that really stood out as maybe something different than you experienced, maybe a little bit of just surprise to you guys that you saw, or any other thing like that you might be interested in sharing? If not, that's fine. We have other things we can get to. Sean?
I just have one, and maybe it's just how I interpreted the the response, but there was the first measure to change for calibration, and I think desired speed was 25%. And maybe I'm thinking of it as, are people using that to, let's say, artificially cause congestion, or is it simply to just check the free flow speeds if they match, you know, the field data? Because I guess if you're using it to force congestion and make cars slow down so you can, you know, check a box on travel time, that I don't think is an appropriate use of that parameter. But maybe I misinterpreted that option, I guess. But that was one thing that kind of stood out for me, I guess.
Johnson, do you want to share anything on that?
No, I mean, you know, it was just like, you know, yeah, not necessarily too much of stuff, but like, you know, I thought, like, you know, whenever I hear people talking about their impression, and as I mentioned, like during the slide, you know, the presentation, whenever I hear people talking about microsim, it's just like, you know, oh yeah, that's just crazy, whatever, you know, stuff like that. So again, as I said, I thought, like, you know, when we asked the question to people saying, like, you know, what do you think, you know, what's your opinion on, you know, microsim being expensive and complicated? I thought like that, you know, was going to be some sort of a harsh responses, but it was like fairly well spread. So it was interesting to see that. And I'm not too sure whether that's because it was like primarily consultants who participated in the survey or not. I don't know. But that was the biggest thing for me. The rest, I think, you know, we kind of sort of expected to a certain extent. Now we could confirm that with some of those responses in my side of things.
Great.
I have one quick question. If we're going to move on to another, I mean, two panelists. Like,
looks like Randy's got his.
Oh, Randy. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I have just one follow-up on the survey results. I guess it's not really surprising, but really more concerning of how much of a Wild West there is still out there in some areas. There's quite the spread there. Well, one thing that really jumped out is the agencies, in a lot of cases, there's some trust issues out there, and some of that comes from their lack of knowledge at this level, and do they have the expertise to properly review these models? That's one thing that we try to address with the protocol documents for Oregon DOT and Washington DOT. And there's a lot of effort and emphasis put up front on the methods and assumptions document and the data collection plan. And while those do tend to add a little bit of cost and schedule to a project, getting those methods and assumptions down to, you know, model extents, what data is going to be collected. Sean had mentioned the issue of, you know, bottlenecks, especially near the model, and how counts may be throughput and not demand. And, you know, properly sizing your model to account for all those issues. Measures of performance and calibration targets. All of those elements go into methods and assumptions. And you want to get stakeholder buy-off, not just on the agency you're doing the work for, but also stakeholder agencies. So if you're doing a DOT project, but you'll have cities and counties reviewing it, make sure everybody's on the same page. And that way, when you get further down the project, there's always this document to go back to saying, this is what we agreed upon. It leaves less question in there and less issue of whose engineering judgment is the best, and that to the analyst's satisfaction, it gets rid of a lot of those questions and subjectivity.
Okay, great. Jonathan, do you have a thing you wanted to finish up? Otherwise, I can move into some of the other questions that the audience.
Oh, then you can move on to now the questions.
Okay, great. So there's quite a number here that we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but again, we will follow up with you guys, with all of you, or have you follow up directly with some of the panelists. But one of these, it's a very in-depth question. I'm going to summarize it by saying, what would you, who might want to talk about this difference between all the time and effort typically spent calibrating to an existing condition versus the fact that we're, you know, also trying to simulate some future condition, right? Like obviously point in time, or geometric configurations or whatever it might be. So kind of this future year calibration aspect of things, and are we overfitting to existing if there's going to be big changes or that? I know I'm paraphrasing because it's quite an in-depth, great question here. But is there anything that Sean or any of you guys might want to address on answering that? Anybody can feel free to jump in based on your own experience.
Yeah, I'll go first, I guess. To some degree, I do agree with that, where we're spending 30% of our budget to dial in something that, 30 years from now, the capacities could be way different with, connected vehicles. Our forecast, you could argue that, hey, are we going to be plus or minus a lane worth of volume based on our regional models and, pandemic coming in and different things. But I guess we've, if you talk to a forecaster, they'll say they've never been wrong on the forecast except for the year it happened, right? That volume's going to happen. It just might not be, it might be sooner than that, or in this case with pandemic, maybe some of those volumes might be delayed. But I guess I would argue in favor of that calibration time though, because if you're off by a noticeable amount for your existing and you carry that forward into the future, I think that just skews your results even more. So I think you need to do, due diligence on and do the best you can with the data you have in your budget to make sure that model represents, at least on the capacity side of it, that it does a pretty good job at reflecting what's out there. And in the future, yeah, you might be able to justify changing some of those parameters if you're pretty confident on things that might be coming in to justify that. But yeah, it's a good question.
Great. Any other comments from the panel?
Yeah, I guess I would say it kind of depends on the type of project you're working on. So if you're in an area where you're doing existing conditions, but there's no congestion currently, and you're just trying to plan for some future growth, then you don't really have to spend a whole lot of time on calibration because there's no real congestion that you're calibrating to, or maybe it's less 15 minutes or less, something along those lines. But if it's a model where currently you have 4 hours of congestion, the growth is going to be there, you're only going to add one lane, so 20 years out, you're still going to have congestion, and the bottleneck is still basically going to be the same location, you just have a little bit more capacity at that location, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a lot of time making sure that you have that bottleneck calibrated appropriately. There's even been some projects where the study area or the project area is, say, upstream of a bottleneck, and that bottleneck that is affecting operations in your project area is going to go away because of some other planned project that's going to be there. And so you really shouldn't be spending a whole lot of time to calibrate to that condition, because all your future models, that condition goes away. The capacity changes quite a bit. So again, it's thinking about how to set up the project, what it means for that bottleneck or that capacity constraint, how important is it to make sure you have it dialed in correctly, and then addressing the right amount of time, because sometimes calibration is 50% of the budget and sometimes it's 10% of the budget, depending on the type of project you're working on.
One thing I'd offer, and maybe this is because most of my modeling is for Midwestern applications, but I find that specifically, especially within VISM, often when I first put everything in, the model operates better than things operate in the field. And I often find that I have to adjust parameters to make the model operate worse so that it better matches the field. And so if you're not doing that, I would be concerned that you might be getting a rosy picture when you start looking at the future cases.
Good point. All right, Randy, you're the only one who didn't say anything on this topic, so now I'm going to put you on the spot. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it largely depends on the project application, like Dave said. So I had one project that we initially, in phase one, we skipped the existing conditions. It was a 2 to 3 lane arterial along the rural urban fringe, and the future condition was basically developing a bunch of city and greenfields. And so it's completely different. The existing signals and all new intersections were all being converted to roundabouts. So it doesn't really matter what we did in the calibration for existing, it was gonna be completely different in the future. And so of course we did our capacity calibration to make sure our roundabouts were properly coded. But then we got to the further along into the future phase of the project, and we had to get to the environmental stage. And at that point, you're required to document your existing conditions. So we actually went back and then added in the existing conditions. But in terms of the project of sizing and determining the roundabout locations and sizes, it didn't really matter. There was no basis for that existing conditions, because every single intersection was changing to a roundabout, which has a completely different behavior set.
Very good point. Yeah, it's great that you guys are sharing all those different experience points. Yeah, Sean.
I just got a quick question for Randy and David, since you both brought it up. In those areas where you don't have, let's say, congestion in the existing, do you guys have local parameter sets that you've used versus, defaults? Because as, Jill mentioned, maybe the default's gonna maybe show too rosy of a picture, but do you have localized sets in the county or state that say, hey, barring any congestion, here's our default headways and different parameter sets?
Yes, definitely. From previous studies and in the same area, we have calibrated bottlenecks. And again, we have to think about when we calibrated those bottlenecks, were they because of narrow lanes or narrow shoulders or grade or some other issue, or were they just the way that were at capacity? In the latter case, that's something that's a good estimate of roadway capacity in this area based on the type of drivers. So those are the type of parameters we can apply for the area. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say similar. We haven't gotten to the extent of creating a library of values specific to locations, but where we've done modeling in the past and sat flow rates from signal departures, we have some values there that we could plug in and apply to similar projects.
I guess what I will say too is that if you don't have any way of calibrating to existing conditions, or the client doesn't want to do that, or that isn't important, then when you're looking at future conditions, really what you need to be saying, rather than this is what the travel time is going to be with this alternative versus this alternative, is you get into more of the relative. We know for this given set of parameters, this alternative will be better, this alternative will be worse in terms of this particular parameter. How much better, how much worse, we don't know, but we can at least provide an assessment of relative performance.
Excellent. Well, great discussion, guys. It's 15 minutes past the hour, so I'm going to call it here. Otherwise, we could talk probably, all day. And I really appreciate all of your input as panelists and being willing to participate and share your experiences, real life experiences applying simulation and all of this. Jong-sun, thank you for getting this survey out there. Everybody, the 300 people who participated in it, that blew us away. I mean, it was a great response. We're super excited. Now you've made it so we're going to survey all the time on everything, and then we're going to, until we hit a point where we only have 5 responses, and then we'll quit surveying altogether. But we really do thank you guys for that. It's huge interest, and we will be in touch. Liz, do you want to go ahead and get us, or Jong-sun, to whatever our final slides are?
So,
oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I just wanted to, quickly mention that, because one of the topics that, that came up every now and then was, the knowledge level or whatever, the fundamentals on, whatever, modeling, understandings on those fundamentals and stuff like that. So I just wanted to bring this up real quick that, there are some opportunities that we've been working on so that we could put this out so that, people could watch and, learn more about, especially those, newcomers or new modelers or however you want to define them. So there are stuff available. So please feel free to use it as much as possible and demand more of those to not me, but Bill, so that we can come up with more of those things, I guess. So that's one of the quickest thing that I wanted to bring up, because again, it's in line with sort of in line with what we were talking about. And I think, that's pretty much it. I think, I would say thank you everyone, panelists and participants and attendees. Hopefully we're gonna meet you all again in the near future with different types of surveys or different types of presentations. With that, Bill?
Yeah, that's it. I'll just say that we will do we will reply to all the questions that didn't get addressed and provide the panelists' contact info. And as Liz mentioned earlier, it is recorded and will be posted on our website in the coming days. So you'll receive a follow-up email from us with all that information. Thank you all again for joining. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Jong-sun, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.